This time it's at the end, so I'm going to invite you up, Michael. In case you're wondering why it's called Delaune Lecture, I'm not going to tell you. Instead, I'm going to say you can buy this little pamphlet, written by Andy Compton. Some of you know that gangster. It's all about Thomas Delaune, and it's €3, so great price. It's a work that Andy did, a good bit of research, and it's about the first evangelical Baptist in this area, and he lost his life. He was a martyr for the faith, so it's a very interesting story and account of his life. So, as a way of honouring his ministry all those years ago, we named these the Delaune Lectures, and Michael is going to be teaching tonight, sharing tonight. Before he gets into that, just a few questions. So, you are a professor of Old Testament.
I am.
Yeah? And a funny word here, Semitics. What's that?
That means that
I know the Old Testament.
You know what the Old Testament is. That means that I teach Hebrew to seminary students who are learning the Old Testament, and I occasionally also teach some other Semitic languages, so like what the Canaanites spoke and some things of the Assyrians and Babylonians, so I teach some of those things as well.
Okay. And I guess you haven't always been a professor.
No, the last 10 years I've served as the executive director of the Evangelical Theological Society. That is a group primarily for professors and pastors internationally. We gather together and study the scriptures together. I've spent some time, 6-7 years in banking in the past, and and then spent some time in the pastorate as well.
Okay. So maybe taking it just back another step. I mean, did you always have an interest in theology? What was your upbringing? Were you Christian home, and how did you become a Christian?
Sure. I grew up in a Christian home, and I honestly, from a young age, knew that I was supposed to teach the scriptures. Don't know why God sort of put that on my heart early. Lots of wandering years, like many in high school and college. God and I had a lovely argument through university about whether I should do medicine or teaching. Shockingly, he won. So at that point, I did religious studies and then on into seminary. Yeah.
Well, it's been great having you here this week. The comment that I've been making to people throughout has been, it's not just academic, it's not just information, it's been really practical and very pastoral. So we look forward to what you have to say tonight. You might have received this in your churches, the title, Who Am I? Work, Wealth and Identity, that's the topic. So Michael's going to go for 45 minutes. And then after that, there'll be opportunity for questions. So as we go through, if you want to jot down anything, please feel free to do that. And then we can have a time of reflection, discussion, and after that, supper. I should welcome Bonnie as well. Bonnie has been here support Michael your wife, so great to have you with us too. So can I pray?
Please.
And then over to you. Father, thank you for your kindness to us. Thank you for providing the gifts of people who are able to understand your word and teach your word. We thank you for Michael this past week, and we ask that you would continue to help him, pour out your spirit on him and upon us, so that we may have understanding of our identity in Christ and how that relates to our work and to our life. So Father, help us, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So while I get set up here, other things you might want to know about us. Oh, forgive me, I'm going to sip while I talk. This being the end of the week, my voice is perhaps a little rougher than the beginning of the week, so this will make sure that we can make it through to the end. No, I'm good. No, I've got a little sip. I'm going to sip. This year is actually our 30th anniversary, so Bonnie and I have been married for 30 years now. We have 2 daughters who are 21 and 24, Abigail and Hannah. They're in university and in graduate school. This is my second time here. I was here last 4 years ago in 2015, and this is Bonnie's first time. So it's been delightful to reconnect with folks that I met last time, hear about how the churches has progressed and what God is doing. and delightful for Bonnie to get to meet many of you that I've been talking about for 4 years now, and for her to be able to see the churches. And so it's been a delight to be here this week. I want to start tonight by taking you back to an earlier period in my life to kind of get a sense of why I am passionate in talking about the idea of our relationship to our, we'll start with occupation, our relationship to our jobs, what we do that earns a living. We were in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was a PhD student at the time. I was during the day studying ancient Near Eastern history and Hebrew Bible and other Semitic languages. And in the evenings, I got a job in a large national bank in the States. I started out, I was answering calls to the center. What's my balance? Why is my account overdrawn? Because you spent more money than you had. Those kinds of things are what I was doing and kind of studying on the side. And it was great because that job was not only helping to pay for school and care for our family, but it was flexible. It was a 24-hour call center. Many of us now we're used to and we expect sort of service to take place. So it meant that I could study and go to school full-time and work, and my work could be around my studies and around the family. And it was fantastic until my program ended. And then when my program ended, I had some sense that, I should actually go do the things that I'm trained to do. So I'm looking for things like jobs in the pastorate or work in the academy where I could put together the skills that God had given me, and that didn't happen. And it didn't happen in the first year, it didn't happen in the second year, and I went on to have what was an unexpected 7-year career in the banking world. I started out on the phones taking calls. By the time I ended, I was running the center that I had been in. But what happened over the time is that my sense of frustration grew. So my perspective was that I was, by God's gifting, a teacher, but by his providence, I was a banker. And I couldn't have articulated at the time why I was so frustrated by the source of my income. That the check wasn't coming from the right kind of place, that it wasn't coming from a teaching institution, or it wasn't coming from the pastorate, but it was coming out of what was, shockingly, a flourishing business career, where the Lord had blessed me and I had risen through the ranks and I was having an impact on people there, but I was somewhat miserable in that circumstance because in my mind, because of where my paycheck came from, I was not who I was supposed to be. Because there should be this clear correspondence between what I'm doing and earning a living and who I perceive myself to be in my gifts, and that was not what God gave in that season. And so in the years since, it's been a long time for me to think, to rethink, to repent, and to learn about what it means when I ask the question, who am I? Because I think for all of those years, what I would say sort of my occupational angst came out of a misunderstanding of who I am, not only as just one created in the image of God, but also as one who has been recreated in the image of Christ. I don't think I really understood who I was. So when I processed my work and I processed my identity, I processed it wrongly. And so I've spent time working through that for myself, and I now love to kind of help other people think through that. So for the time that we have together tonight, what I want to do is to ask the question, what is the relationship between our identity and I'm going to say a little bit more broadly, our economic activity? Because what I find is when I have this conversation with folks, for some people like me, it was all about my vocation and where I was earning a living. For other folks, it may be more rawly about what I have or don't have, or my position within the community that may be more of a thing of angst. But those are all things that come to drive our identity in many cases. What we have, what we don't have, what we want, what we need, and where we sit within the particular community that we're in are oftentimes things that drive identity. So we're going to think a bit more broadly about the relationship between our identity and our economic activity. And I cannot think of any place that would be better for us to do that than Genesis 1. And so we're going to spend the majority of our time tonight thinking about Genesis 1 and what it means to be created in the image of God and how that drives our identity and what that means for our relationship to our economic activity. I would assert that Genesis 1 teaches us that human flourishing is God's intention for humanity. And in fact, it's actually one of the primary reasons that he created us in his image. That's a rather bold assertion, but it's based on two key observations of the account of humanity's creation in Genesis 1, 26 to 28. So let me just read that for us here. Genesis 1:26, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Then he goes on to teach them about how he's provided for their care through the food that he's given them. So if we look at this, the first observation that we should make is that if you were to read a different translation from the one that I did, the ESV, if you were to read, for instance, the NIV, it would put it this way in Genesis 1:26. It would say, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky. There is a particular grammatical construction here in the Hebrew that indicates a purpose for the creation. I think here the NIV is the correct translation for this. It is the idea that when God decided to make us in his image, he had a particular purpose in mind for that, and that purpose was our vocation as humanity, to be those who would rule over the creation that he was going to make, those who would care for it and tend to it, and those who would be put here in order to do that work. And so when we look at this, it is the idea that then if we want to understand our relationship to vocation, we need to back up and understand our making in his image. Because what this text asserts, and that little change in translation that we have there, that he did that for this reason, means then that all the work that we do is not our identity, it flows from our identity. So to that extent, if I swap work and put it up front, I've missed the way that God has created me. So we want to explore then what does it mean to be made in the image of God, and then how does that connect with the work that he has called us to do? And so to that extent, we need to ask the question is, what do we have here in terms of being made in the image of God? Well, historically, theologians and other interpreters, when we've looked at that, have looked for ways in which we are different from the other things that were created. So whether it is our intellectual ability, our communication, something about us that is more reminiscent of God than what we find in the animal life that was created, that's normally where we have looked for that. But the more that we've studied the text and thought about its language and looked at it in its ancient Near Eastern context, it becomes clear that that's not the primary focus of what it means to be made in his image. All of the language of the image is language of kingship. It is language of those who serve specifically, not just as kings, but as what we might call vice regents. So the two terms that are used here, image and likeness, are found, for instance, in relationship to a statue that a king might place in a far-flung part of the realm, which bears his likeness, so it is reminiscent of him, but its primary function is to reflect his presence there where he physically is not. So that we look at the idea of image and likeness, what we're really thinking of is something that is connected to the high king, but is reflective of him somewhere else. So that we might think of the nature of our being created in the image of God as what I would call a representational reign. We are put here to rule on the earth, but we do it specifically by representing God, in whose image we have been created. That means then that everything about the way in which we reign in this rule is dual purpose. It is informed by our connection to him and who he is, but it is designed to be reflective of him in the world, so that we are not independent and free-flowing as those who would reign. We are not making it up as we go, but we are here specifically to represent him in this world and to reign on his behalf as a vice regent might. And so we might think about image and likeness in these ways. A son or daughter is literally created in the image of his or her parents. They bear their likeness, they bear their marks, they are alike. But they also, when people see them, they see you in them. And they can tell oftentimes who belongs together and where they go. And so it is this sort of familial idea that we represent him, and when people see us, they are to see the connection between us and the one in whose image we have been made. So the terms are not completely synonymous, image and likeness, but they are in fact quite close, and they do overlap a bit. People oftentimes ask, well, one of them said, according to, the other is in. Is there any difference in the prepositions? And the answer is no. They're roughly synonymous as well. And so oftentimes, although we're looking for something really specific and really defined, the text of Genesis 1 does not give us a definition of the image. Instead, what it tends to teach us is how the image functions. So it doesn't provide a definition. It doesn't say, here's what defines the image. It gives us how the image functions in the world. So think about it this way. When we look at Adam, what's the first thing that he does? He speaks, just like the God who created him. Just like the God who created him, he orders his world. Remember how orderly Genesis 1 is. Each thing is created and it reproduces according to its kind. The creation itself is ordered as God created in days 1, 2, and 3. The environments for the things that will be created, the critters that will be created in days 4, 5, and 6. The whole thing is an extraordinarily orderly account of how God would put the world together. And Adam's first thing is to name the animals, and then to recognize in obedience to that ordering that none of those animals are a suitable mate for him. And so he lives by the created order that God has given. We see this. So we don't see a definition, but we see its function in the garden, where Adam represents God and works, if you will, works after him. He does the same kind of work, and he represents God in the world. So I would summarize my understanding of the image this way. Being made in the image of God means that as humans, we are connected to God, and we are designed to be reflective of God. We are created to have a representational reign on earth whereby we live out our identity as humans. This basic understanding can be confirmed as we see that this term image is used of Seth as one connected to his father by birth, and who is like, that is to say, reflective of his father. We see it in the command to Noah that human life must be valued because it is made in the image of God. And so communities will have to deal with murder because the taking of one life connected to and reflective of God so terribly violates our identity. We see it used in the term for Israel as son and priest, as son who is one who is like the Father, and as a priest, one who is connected to but reflective of the God that they serve to the community around them. So the mediatorial role is also part of being in the image, and we see it flow out in Adam's representational reign as he moves forward in his work in the garden. So, how does this impact then our understanding of being made in the image of God and its relationship to our economic activity? Well, first and foremost, I think it deepens our connection and establishes that our deepest connection is not with our occupation, but is with the God who created us. Okay? Now, this is also going to do some other things that we'll pick up a little bit later. It also means that when we have economic conflict, which primarily in the Western world today will be conflict between those who have and those who don't, between wealthy and poor, between different economic classes. It also means that my deepest connection is not with those who are like me socioeconomically. My deepest connection is with everyone who has been created in the image of God. And then secondarily, as the church, with those who have been recreated, made new creatures in the image of Christ. But part of what this does, if I understand this, I'm not just limiting my connections with those who are in the church. It establishes a means for me to think about those who are outside the church as also those who are created in the image of God, and therefore not defined by their occupation and not defined by their socioeconomic status either, which is something we, I think, desperately need in the West to come to an understanding of. So I will tell you, one of the most painful circumstances in my life was I went a year without a job. And I can tell you that almost to a person, everyone you meet asks you two questions. Who are you? What's your name? And what's the second one? What do you do? And you hear that long enough over a year when you have no work, and it's very tempting to say, I have no identity. I can give you a name, but I can't tell you anything else about who I am. I think it's the same way for someone who is perhaps not like my circumstances, but who is working maybe with a high education or with a specific job set, and now the economy has changed, and they have to work in a field and perhaps for a pay that does not reflect what they had in the past. And all of a sudden, what is their identity when now I'm working in this circumstance instead of where I had been before? We are frequently tempted to tie our identities to the places where we work in such a way that we forget the commonality of our creation in the image of God. And even as the church, we can forget the sweetness of our having been recreated, made new creatures in the image of Christ as the foundation of who we are. And the other things, we'll get to this in just a second, and all these other things will be added. Right? They are the other things. They come after the pursuit of righteousness. They come after the pursuit of his plan. They're the things that are added. They're not unimportant, but they're not at the core of who we are and how God has created us to be. I think the second thing that this is important for us to see is that being created in the image of God also means that it's not just my creation in the image of God, it is also your creation in the image of God. Let me unpack that for a minute. Humanity, even in the beginning, is a plurality. It is Adam and Eve. And we don't have all of humanity until we have both of them. And God has designed us as the ones in his image to work communally and cooperatively. So if I'm willing to acknowledge for myself my creation in the image of God, I must also acknowledge yours. And then that means whether we are distanced by language or by culture or by socioeconomics or by race, if I understand my identity as one who is tied to him, I must also recognize that in you as well, regardless of what other differences there may be between us. It sets us on a completely different footing to think about the nature of who we are. It's not me, it's we who are the humanity God created in his image. We are the ones that are designed to be connected to God and reflective of God, both individually and collectively. So a concentrated focus on our identity as ones created in his image highlights what joins us first and places economic status and other things to put some secondary to what is most true of us, God's definition of us as humanity created in his image. But there is more than this. We are all united as one created difference, and it allows us to work through differences that we have if we understand this. Now, I would say the second thing is we unpack the image as it works out in Genesis 1 and 2 that will change the way we think about our economic activity, is that if we read the text well, we'll find out that work actually is worship. That's the way the text it reads. Now, worship is always kind of a hard thing because if you look at someone, a prof, a pastor, a church member, and you go, what is worship? You might get a standard, well, worship, I've heard it's worthship. I'm going to declare the worth of God. But you press much beyond that and you get kind of blank stares. And sort of, I'm not sure how to put my hand around what this definition is. So in looking at some of the most recent literature on worship, I think this is a great definition of worship. Worship involves our reverence, our submission, and our homage before God, who we recognize as the divine sovereign, as the master and Lord of all. And it's these acts, our reverence, our submission, our homage, which is in response to his gracious revelation of himself. So worship is our honoring of him, our reverence before him, recognizing him as the Lord who has chosen to reveal himself to us, and now our worship is in response to him. Now, why would I say that work in Genesis 1 and 2 is worship? Well, it's because of intentional word choices in the text. They indicate that we should understand Adam's work as worship. First of all, Adam was placed, literally caused to rest in the garden. And rest is typically in Scripture a symbol of our salvation. We go into rest. They enter the land and have rest there. And Hebrews will look back on that and say it's like entering into salvation. So he was caused to rest by God in the garden in order to work it and to keep it. Now, rest points forward literally to Noah and the deliverance from the flood, to the rest Israel would have from their enemies in the land. But the terms work and keep are understood literally in the garden. They were supposed to tend the garden. But later, these same words will be used to describe temple service, the people's relationship to God's revelation, and the works of the priests. Adam's work was designed to be his intentional, reverential response to God's provision and as a pointer forward to later work and worship. I'm going to read you just a short snippet from Jonathan Wilson's wise analysis of the relationship between worship, blessing, and work. Worship is the fullest enactment and extension of God's blessing. It is the work of the people that enacts our conviction that our creation in his image is a blessing that gives us the setting and the resources for living. In worship, we are most fully alive, but we must not draw a firm line between the work of worship and the other work that we do. They are somewhat separate, but as the Sabbath command reveals, the worship work and work make it possible for us to enjoy God's blessing. True human flourishing is worship. To the extent that good things, flourishing things that happen in individual lives and marriages, families, societies, or economies are disconnected from worship of God, then to that extent they are not truly flourishing. David was someone that I worked with in the bank. And David was perhaps the most successful individual that I worked with. He rose the corporate ladder quickly. He was made in charge of the division that I worked in, and he was by all accounts extremely successful. Everyone envied what was happening in David's life. David soon had all the trappings of his new position. There was a new house and a new car and a new wife who was suited to be the hostess that he needed for the business functions that he would have. But we began to notice that after a trip to his manager's house that they had just moved into, David had a very realistic picture of what it would take to make his humble home sufficient for the world that he had moved into. For David in his relationship with his wife, his suggestions of plastic surgery that would make her perfect haunted his mind and her reality. Ultimately, over the course of his career, the houses and the cars and the wives could not satisfy him. And he was known to say to people that he felt like he was dying. And no one understood what he meant because he was, by all accounts, one of the most successful people that they knew. It is clear from the scriptures that not all work and not all worship is flourishing. False worship is consistently described in work language. So I want you to follow this sort of tragic train of Old Testament thought. We are called the work of God's hands. We're, in essence, his economic activity, as it were. Our economic produce is called the work of our hands, but idols are also the work of our hands. When work ceases to be done within the framework of our identity, our creation in the image of God, we direct our worship to our economic output, whether literal idols or vocation, resources, or social standing. This is dangerous territory because, as Psalm 115 clearly teaches, we become what we worship. So if we worship death, we become those who are dead. And Psalm 15 will declare that the dead do not worship God. But God's people worship him for all time and forever. Worshiping the Creator, the source of life, yields life. Worshipping the creation of creatures cut off from the source of life yields death. This is why flourishing, which oftentimes gets reduced in current context to economic stability and growth, cannot be separated from identity, nor can it replace our identity. We are connected to God by creation, but now in the presence of sin, we must be reconnected to Him by salvation. We need to be recreated, made anew in the image of God, in the image of His Son, so that we might truly reign as His representatives, and so that we might truly flourish. It is in this idea that we see that flourishing is more than a mandate to reign, and it's more than physical well-being. It is holistic, it is work, and it is worship. It is our reverential response to His revelation of Himself to us. He has revealed Himself, and we are obligated to respond. Human flourishing is work, and it is worship. It is holistic, involving all of life, and it cannot be separated from the rest of creation, from our physical bodies and lives, or from our spiritual state. So if I understand that my economics all flow out of my identity, and I understand that what I do with all of that is an act of worship in response to His revelation, and that it is a cooperative thing that we do, then we must look a little bit more at what it looks like when we come into conflict in terms of our flourishing. Now, just a little thought experiment with me here. Imagine that Genesis 3 has not taken place. There's been no fall. Okay, just for a minute. Adam and Eve are in the garden, they're having children, and they're fulfilling the command to multiply and fill the earth. Okay? They're going to eventually fill the garden. They're going to spill out of the garden into other places. And as they get into the other places, we're going to find out that those other places are different. Okay? We're going to read at the beginning of chapter 2, really in verse 10, that if you were to look around the creation areas are different. There's gold in this place, and there's onyx in that one, and there's bdellium over here, and oh, the gold in this place is better than the gold in that place. In the beginning, there would have been economics, even without the fall. Because as humanity spread around the world, God had naturally designed that there would be different resources in different places of differing qualities, and we would need to cooperate communally to provide what each other would need. So you may move into a place where there's stone, and I live where there's timber. And we may each need what the other has. And so we're going to figure out a way of working together now without sin, without anything that is inappropriate in that relationship, but in a way that says our work is going to have to complement each other because God has not put everything all in one place for you or for me. So that we're going to have this economic cooperation, and we're going to have differing resources, even differing quality of resources, even before the presence of sin. So what God has created is not, if you will, a sameness, but He has created a quality. So think about the nature of the way Paul will talk about the gifts that are given in the body. There's not sameness. Not everyone is gifted alike. And those gifts will be of varying nature. Some will be upfront and public. Some will be more hidden and private. Paul will use honorable and dishonorable kinds of things, but they're different. They're not the same, but they are equal in that each one is absolutely necessary for the body to function as it does, and we cannot do without a single one, regardless of how high or low we think of that. Whether we think of the face or the big toe, both are absolutely necessary. They're not the same, but they are equal. They are both given at the discernment of the Spirit as He chooses. They are equal, but they are not the same. And they're each empowered by the gifting of the Spirit. They are equal, but they are not the same. And we know that in Paul's days, just as we would find today, just as we would see in economic conflict, there was conflict over the lack of sameness in the gifts. Because my gift is showier or flashier than yours. Somehow, there's more of Christ in me than in you. And because God has given me a gift that is hidden, out of the way, in the shoe, somehow I'm not worth the same as you. The answer Paul gives is the same. It's the same Spirit that gave this. Old Testament, it's the same God who created you in his image. It is the same God who designed us to function together as one body, communally and cooperatively. It's God who created humanity to function together. Male and female at first to create the most fundamental element of society, the family. And then the larger community, as it would grow, would have to cooperate together to use all the resources God had given in order for everyone to flourish. That looks exactly like how he's designed the church. So for us to understand this, we have to understand that there will always be conflicts over the lack of sameness, and the issues that we have to work with are the issues of equality. Now, it's easy to say this, but we do have to acknowledge the fact that it's not as though economics are an unimportant thing. So in the year that I did not have work, right, that's a serious thing for the family, and how will we be cared for, and how will we be fed, and how will we provide? For those who have nothing, or all has been lost, or all has been taken, economics are not inconsequential. But notice how Jesus weaves these ideas together in the Sermon on the Mount. Do not be anxious, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Well, what are these things? It's our lives, what we eat, what we drink, and what we wear. These are not unimportant things in that they are somehow excluded from the kingdom or from the church. Far from that, he simply says that we ought not worry about them because our Father knows our needs. And just as he cares about the intimate details of the animal world, he cares for us too. The most important thing, he says, is to pursue your relationship with him, his righteousness. To put it in Genesis terms, it's to realize that he's our creator and we're made in his image, now recreated, made in the image of his son. That's foundational to the activities and needs that we have of flourishing. So how do we then deal with these issues of conflict? Well, I think I'm going to stop here and just take our last 5 minutes and just think about this in terms of economic conflict that is prominent in the West today, between those who have and those who do not. I would say that first of all, if we were to look at the scriptures fairly and honestly, scripture will tell us that there are multiple sources of wealth and there are multiple sources of poverty. What tends to happen, though, is that if I am wealthy, I will tend to notice only some sources of wealth and only some causes of poverty. Likewise, if I'm poor, I'll only notice other ways in which people become wealthy and other ways in which people become poor. So let me lay this out for you. The scriptures will give us the idea that there are wealthy who are righteous and there are poor who are righteous. There are wealthy who are wicked and there are poor who are wicked. Right? So think about the people that God blessed, like Abraham and Solomon and others, who was God's free gift to them that he would make them wealthy and do that with them. They didn't do it by stealing it from others or taking it away or abusing the poor. It was through their hard work and their diligence. The language of the Proverbs, right? Through diligence, through work, through effort, through planning, through wisdom, they became wealthy. But the scriptures will also talk about people who become wealthy because they cheat and they lie and they steal and they abuse the poor. Flip that. There are many poor in the scripture because they've been taken advantage of. Someone has rigged the judicial system. Someone has lied in court about them, or someone has simply steamrolled them because they have the power to do it. But there are also poor in scripture who spend a little too much time in the bed, turning over on the mattress like a door on its hinges. Right? They love to watch the scurrying little ants out there because they're entertaining, but not necessarily following in their pattern of work. There are people who loan speculatively is one of the things that they talk about, trying to make the quick buck, and it doesn't quite pan out, like the lotto not returning shockingly with, we do this in the U.S. all the time. You can win $1 million, $1 billion on this for just your $1 that you're going to spend 5 days a week, every week, having never won before, never likely to win again. But it'll make us rich. So if there is no one size fits all, then it means then when it comes to economic conflict, I cannot assume any prevailing narrative of anyone. So if I'm wealthy, likely my prevailing narratives are that I got here because I was righteous and worked really hard. And if you're not in many of the cultural settings, you might be in the other place because you really didn't take advantage, you didn't do well, you didn't work hard, you didn't do all those things. I don't know you, I can't assume that. Because what the law will teach in Israel is that you may not, and this is shocking, it's backwards of what we think. In Israel, you may not rule for the poor person without evidence. But you also may not defer to the rich because they're powerful. Everybody needs to be judged on the basis of evidence and in the search for truth. So we cannot assume a narrative. If I'm poor, I may not assume that you are rich because you ran over me or over someone else to take it and steal it. I also can't assume that I'm in my circumstances because it's your fault. A hard look at my life is required. So the first step in dealing with economic conflict is to step back to the place where we are and ask, what is our identity? Our identity is as ones made in the image of God. You and I share a connection regardless of whether I'm rich or poor and you are poor or rich. It doesn't matter. We have a connection because we're created in the image of God. That means I assume nothing of you other than the fact that you're made in His image. And if it comes time that we must evaluate my life or yours, we evaluate not based on cultural narratives of who's more likely to be in the right or in the wrong. We evaluate it as the law demands, each one giving evidence and coming together to assert what is right and what is wrong. This is James all over, not deferring to the wealthy to bring them in and give them the pride of place here up front because they should be deferred to. And it's not to stick the poor at the back because somehow they are less worthy in our cultural eyes. No, everyone is worthy in the world because they've been created in the image of God, and everyone within the church because they've been recreated into the image of His Son and are being made and moved into His image more and more each day. So these are the ways in which I think that we can move forward in our own lives with relationship to our economic activity and in relationship to those who are struggling and wrestling with what they perceive as their identity over against someone else's identity because of where they stand in the community, with their job, or with their resources. Now, this focus on identity does not lead us to neglect justice or even conflict that can come in the face of unrighteousness. Rather, it instructs us to the pursuit of true justice. In this pursuit, no prevailing or presumed narrative can be automatically applied to individuals or groups. Rather, we are guided neither to be partial nor to show deference to anyone. Instead, each case is fully considered and justice is rendered on the basis of the factual record. Justice is rendered regardless of the power of the accused. Grace is extended regardless through individual acts of sacrifice and generosity, and through communal acts of compassion, and through the structured societal efforts to alleviate poverty and conflict. So who am I? And how do I relate to my work, to my wealth, and how do I think about my identity? The scriptures would teach us that in the first instance, everything that I do and everything that I have must flow out of who I am. And that means in its first instance, as one created in the image of God, to be connected to Him and reflective of Him. But it means in the second instance, as a follower of Christ, to be one who is connected to Christ and now serves as, instead of the representational reign image of the Old Testament, it's the ambassadorial reign. I am here to represent the great King in a kingdom that I would like to invite you to join and to be a citizen with me. All of my activity has to be framed through that lens. So whether God has called me in this moment to be that ambassador by teaching, by preaching, or whether He's called me to be that ambassador by working in the bank and doing a job that I didn't think I should be doing, I do it as an act of worship for Him. Now, let me close here with the end of my story. My banking career took off, and it was, I look back at that time and cringe. Because I'm not sure there's anyone who leads so well or so joyfully as Eeyore. And that's what I was. I think about my family. My children were very young at the time. I can't imagine what life was like for Bonnie as I groused my way through 7 years. 7 years in which God was preparing me with leadership skills, finance, some technical web skills because of things that I did at the bank, preparing me for the ETS job that I had working at the Evangelical Theological Society. When that job was posted, within the day, I had 4 friends who called me and said, have you seen the job? They need a scholar who understands finance, can do management, and needs to do a little bit of work on the web. This was a decade later. I had no idea that God was graciously preparing and educating me for a job that I knew nothing about, that wouldn't even be created for a decade, to which all my friends would say, you were made for that. This is your description. You need to look at this job. I've been in that job for 10 years now. Instead of managing what could have been a flourishing garden, I groused and grumbled my way through it because I assumed that the source of my paycheck was also a part of the source of my identity. If only I had understood what that would mean, that season and all that God did in it could have looked so remarkably different than it did. Only when we ground ourselves in our creation and our recreation in His image will we properly understand our occupations, our wealth, and our resources. Thank you. All right. So we are open for questions now. Anything? Yeah.
You spoke about the connection between flourishing and worship, and also the connection between flourishing and our economic activity. I just wondered if you could talk about the connection between flourishing and potentially negative activity or suffering as Christians, perhaps regression rather than progression, and what our position should be in terms of worship and flourishing.
Yeah, I think that we have to recognize the realities of how hard it is when we are not flourishing economically to flourish in our worship. Paul will use language of sort of opportunity, right? That I have the opportunity to learn what it means to have little and what it means to live when I have enough and what it means to live when I have even more than I need. That we have the opportunity when I have joy to then be in joyful relationship with others, when I've had sorrows to have compassion and care for them. So I think we have to think of not the idea that somehow it's good, and I don't think it is inherently good to not have what you need. That's a sign of the world is broken. It's part of the fall, that we don't have all that we need to care for, and the reality of those who really actually do suffer. But we have the opportunity to see it, understanding Him as Father, and that He ultimately will provide for me, even if that is not in this life, but in the next, at His coming or my going home, that we have an opportunity to learn that as something that we can pour out into others. If my economic circumstances, however, are my identity, then my identity is it's on a roller coaster and all over the place. The only way we have enough stability to think about the fact that I could flourish through little and through much is to have that right thing. Worship, then, I think, is one of the keys that works in both directions. Because in worship, we rehearse the truths about God and about my relationship with Him in a way that helps solidify my identity when I'm weak. Right? When I'm struggling and life is hard, worship helps reaffirm who I am and the truths about that. But then it also reminds me when life is good, it re-anchors me in a way that says this is contingent, this is what's significant. And so I think it works at both ends to help us, whether we're wrestling or whether we're actually in plenty, to kind of keep us in the right direction. I think is one of the roles that worship plays for us. Yeah. Others? Tom?
I don't really know how to phrase it as a question, but can you share any of your experience of what it was like to work in a I suppose, a flourishing business career in a setting which had very different values to you. So like in a business career, in a banking career, where the management, where the executives, where the CEO essentially of those groupings will be, their values won't be towards God, and will be moving the company maybe in directions which won't be illegal but may not speak to the same values that you would have. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, so the bank was a great example of this. I'll give you my favorite one. The bank that I worked in, which I won't name, only valued shareholders. Okay, so as an employee, you were basically a servant there to service the shareholder. We never told this to our customers, but it was absolutely true. And the most egregious version of it was that at one point they actually ran what they called the Supply Olympics. Okay, so the bank is flourishing, they're pulling money, and this was not a tight time at the company. We were just about ready to double our stock and then sell. I mean, it was really going mad at that point. And the Supply Olympics was that you, as an hourly worker, were supposed to go home, purchase or scrounge supplies for the office and bring them in to help us be more efficient. Right? So you've got people who are making barely minimum wage, and you're supposed to go buy pencils and rubber bands and staples and paper clips, and you're shamed into bringing those materials in so that we could raise shareholder value. Okay? So in those moments, sometimes all you can do is outright resistance and go, this is insanity. And look at what you're saying about your customers and your shareholders. In other ways, though, there may be more positive things that you can do. So the bank was when I started, a very individualistic environment. And so it was all about your sales and your production and what you could do. And we eventually organized more into teams. And what we were, at least part of what a few of the believers that I was involved with were able to do, was really to kind of demonstrate that we flourished better. We had better sales, we had better service. We were generally rated better when we cooperated together and worked as a unit as opposed to just individuals. And so there's some ways in which we could instill or demonstrate values that we held that the company did not. But largely, it is almost not at the corporate level because you're so small as an individual and the corporation is so great. All you can really do is affect your local set that you're in and instill values there, so care for the individual and those things. I didn't stay in long enough to have a sense of what it might look like to impact the corporation to know about that, but it's difficult. Yeah. Johnny.
Can you say something about giving? So from your Old Testament background, tithing, tithing of our finances, resources, time, how does that all work? Should we have a certain figure or?
Oh, you want the whole thing? Wow, good. This is why I'm leaving town tomorrow. We didn't arrange this question ahead of time. So I think that the fundamental, we put this in three ways. First of all, I think we need to think of our giving as giving of what supports our very life. Okay? When they brought in their offering, they were bringing in cash, they were bringing in food. Right? So I'm bringing in 1/10 of everything I might be able to feed the family this year and bringing that in from the crops and dropping it in the offering to care for the goings-on of the temple and those things. So we have to change our mindset. Cash in the pocket or whatever can be something that is almost inconsequential, depending on how much we give. But when we think of it as what enables us to live the lives that we live, now we begin to get more in the mindset of what they brought in. Okay? As they brought this in, then we have to think about the idea that part of what they were demonstrating is that there were people who could survive with no income. The Levites, they had no land. So they did not generate any of their own income. They could not farm. They didn't have the resources to live. So it was a very cooperative way to look at what would it take for us to care for people and to do that. What would it look like to truly trust your very existence to the other people of God? So it is very much a communal thing that you take on when you do that. And so I would encourage, I'm telling you, we didn't talk about this beforehand, but as someone who has been in the pastorate, it is a powerful thing to understand that your livelihood, your existence, the feeding of your family comes from the love and generosity of the other people of God. And it builds a sort of dependence, not dependence in a bad way, but dependence in God is literally providing this through you and through you. And it builds that communal sense of what God is doing in a way that I found almost difficult to fully express to our church. So I don't understand, you are my lifeblood, and God has given you for that very purpose to do that. So to think about the communal nature of it. And the other thing to think is it was, even in the Old Testament, it still had to be planned and regular. And by that I mean there were things that they didn't give into the pot, but there were things that they had to be ready to give. Think of Boaz and his field. He has to plan ahead to tell his workers not to go around the margins, not to take a second trip through, not knowing whether or not today you are going to show up and glean in his field. He just has to have it ready to go so that it's available when the need is there. We would think of that today as financial margin. And that, whether we're talking about the regular giving that Paul talks about, set it aside and do it on a regular basis, to have margin requires forward thinking. And so I do think that we have to think about what's there. Now, I think the New Testament does not repeat the tithe in particular as a percentage. Even Paul in his instructions on their planning was what you and God come to in your heart together. So I think there is more of an emphasis on the New Testament of not more or less giving, but of giving that is a bit less regulated, right? Because here it was sort of part of an economic system, and out here it is, you're going to have to pray, and this is going to be between you and God. Now that was always the case, right? A priest would never know when you show up with bales and sacks and sacks. I don't know how much came off your field. That's always been between you and God, even when it was defined as a tenth. But it was far more. If you look at the numbers, it's way beyond a tenth. It's probably closer to a third of what they actually gave out of their income every year. But I do think even there, it had to be planned and regular because you have to look forward to have the margin in order to give it when it's needed. So I think the principles are all largely the same as for the New Testament that we should be thinking of. Forward thinking, how do we build margin into our lives and giving out of that margin both regularly, as Paul would say, set it aside and be ready to give it, but also ad hoc when the need arises, and then we have something that we can contribute with and use that to bless someone else, even when we didn't know that they would need it today. I think those same principles are at play. Yeah, Dean.
Just thinking about the concept of retirement, sometimes there's this expectation that I want to retire early, like in my early 40s or early 50s, in order not to do anything else afterwards. So I want to be retired at 50 and then spend my last 20 or 30 years just in a cruiser or just doing that. And I think even among Christians there is this expectation just to be of, I want to retire and then just do anything, nothing else afterwards. What's the biblical concept of retirement in the Old Testament?
I think it's called death. I have to be honest. I don't. So I say that rather flippantly, but all right. But we are talking about a different world because for the most part we are talking about a subsistence economy. And so if you've ever actually farmed for a living or known someone who does, there is no retirement because at the point that everybody on the farm retires, there's no more food or income coming in. So there is a sense in which their connection to daily life and their sustenance was so much tighter than ours. They look different. So I think it is conceptually, I can see retirement being considered in some ways like when Paul's on support and when Paul is tent making. Right? So I could see a season of time where we might dedicate ourselves because now I am free from the constraints of a daily work routine, that I might be more freed for ministry because I have a source of income that doesn't require me to be in the market and doing those things. I think we could look at that as in those ways that would be perfectly acceptable in the biblical period and in the biblical principles to look at something like that. But simple recreation removed from any productive engagement where it is solely self-focused, I think there's no concept in the scriptures of that kind of retirement that takes place. So I don't think you necessarily are obligated to work as we would think of it. You could be wise and set that aside and then free yourself for a whole different kind of life. But I think if that life is not the life you describe as sort of retirement just on the cruiser, or in the U.S. it might be in the RV roaming around the country, but I'm not even roaming the country with the intent of meeting you at a campground and sharing the gospel and spending time in your church and strengthening it. If it's just because we want to see the things and go and live a life that's detached from the church, detached from community, detached from everything other than us, then I think there's no biblical concept of that at all. So I'd want to be careful in that I don't want to castigate retirement. I want to castigate retirement that is solely self-focused. That has no place in the Scriptures. I think there are people who have done wonderful things. We had friends who I won't name, because who knows if they would ever see this. He grew up in California, and so they had been in California for 30 years, and they left at the height of the housing market. Sold their house. The joke around their home was that the store had run out of drywall, out of wallboard, so they used oak instead. He was just trying to not pay taxes, and so they just poured money in the house. But they built a house that they could do youth retreats in. They built a house that we held almost all of our elder pieces in. They built a house that they could use for that. And then they started a foundation with the money that they had done. And they would actually give funds out to their children with the instructions of go spend this for other people's good. And they would do those kinds of things. And so he was retired for years. We pastored together. And so he had leisure time to meet with anyone in the church who needed to meet. He had time available because God had blessed and he had been really wise. And so he was retired for as long as most people work. And he used that time, probably one of the people I would say that, honestly, I don't think I've ever seen anyone who used their money as well as they did, and they had tons of it. But they just poured it out into people and into God's work and in individuals and in causes. And so in that respect, I would say he was totally successful in his retirement because all it did was take away the time he spent at work, which he did enjoy and he valued, and he put that time back into people in other ways. So if the retirement has the right priorities and still reflects our creation in the image and our recreation in the image of the Son, then I think retirement can be fine. Yeah. Excellent.
Maybe, is there just one more question? That's okay, because we are going to have supper, and you will be available to talk to a little bit more. So please come back to Michael if there's anything on the subject tonight, or on anything on the Old Testament. He's your man. So any of those questions you don't know, come and ask. I want to mention a couple of things before we have supper. On your seat, Munster Bible College modules, so this one here, so we've just completed the Old Testament. Dustin Benj is coming for church history in June, and then we have Kirk Wellham doing pastoral theology, and that's in September time. So if you've enjoyed tonight, we encourage you to sign up for one of those modules. You can come in at an audit level where you just sit, listen and take in. You can come at a certificate level where you do a little kind of reflective piece, takes a little bit of work, where you can do the full diploma, which is the reading and the exams as well. So we encourage you to look into that. And also at the back, you'll see the cabinets there with lots of books in it. And that's available at a very good cost, €5, isn't that right, Seth, for a year? So books that you don't have.
Return Canada.
Sorry?
Yes, that's somebody's return in Canada.
No, we want them back, don't sell them. So you can just fill that out, and you can have access to that, but you can talk to Seth in the back there, who will tell you a bit more. And to know a bit more as well about the modules coming up, these are available at Church History, Pastoral Theology, and our Master's class, which is for those who've completed their studies. That's on the table at the back there as well. So do pick them up, have a read through, and consider coming along and joining us in Munster Bible College. It meets here, and thanks, Eddie, for the way in which you open up the church and the supper that's provided tonight. We appreciate that very much. And to thank you, Michael, especially. It's a great treat, it's a great honour to have you be able to come here and have access to such great teaching over the course of the week and tonight as well. So thank you for taking the time out to come here. And you're arriving back on Friday and straight back into teaching on Monday. So thank you very much.